Even under normal operation, the system was so unreliable that many boats were expected to operate safely for only about 3,000 hours, barely enough for a few months of deployment. Fires, electrical failures, and radiation leaks became routine. Tragically, sailors would pay with their health, and often with their lives. The lead ship, K3, perfectly embodied the November-class nightmare. Although publicly celebrated as a heroic technological triumph, surfacing dramatically near the North Pole in 1962, its crew were secretly suffering radiation sickness throughout the mission. Later, in 1967, a devastating fire on board killed 39 sailors, yet the submarines somehow continued to limp through service until 1988. Built to prove Soviet superiority, the November-class instead became infamous as one of the most dangerous submarines ever created, a rushed Cold War gamble that sacrificed safety for pride and left a legacy written in tragedy. Battleships were meant to be floating fortresses, symbols of strength, power, and national pride. But in the early 1900s, the Austro-Hungarian Empire created a class of battleships so poorly protected that they could be destroyed by something as small as a fast motorboat. By 1909, Austria-Hungary realized it was falling dangerously behind the naval powers of Europe. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy were all building powerful dreadnoughts. Worse, Italy, Austria's uneasy ally, was rapidly strengthening its navy. With political tensions rising, Vienna decided it needed a modern, fearsome fleet to secure dominance in the Adriatic Sea. Admiral Rudolf Montecuccoli led the charge, determined to build state-of-the-art battleships known as the Tegethoff class. But from the very beginning, the project was cursed with politics, secrecy, and desperation. The Hungarian government collapsed, budgets froze, and for over a year no money could legally be spent. So Montecuccoli did something bold and illegal. Working with shipyards and banks in secret, he began construction anyway, without approval and without funding, risking his career and national scandal. By the time Parliament finally recovered, 2 battleships were already under construction, forcing the government to accept the project. It looked like a daring success story, but what eventually rolled off the slipways was a disaster. The ships were designed by naval architect Siegfried Popper, who was working under brutal pressure, limited money, political chaos, and shrinking design limits. He fitted the ships with powerful triple-gun turrets to save space and weight, but they turned out far heavier than expected, warping the hull and forcing emergency structural reinforcement. And worse, critical armor protection was sacrificed. While the main belt armor was decent, the underwater protection was shockingly weak. At a time when torpedoes were a known and deadly threat, especially in the confined Mediterranean, the Tegethoff class was given barely 1.6 meters of underwater defense. Thin plating, minimal bulkheads, essentially no meaningful torpedo protection at all. Even the legendary German admiral Alfred von Tirpitz reviewed the design and immediately warned that the ships were dangerously vulnerable. But the advice was ignored. The ships sailed anyway, and that flaw would doom them. On June 10, 1918, Italian captain Luigi Rizzo led a daring torpedo attack against the Austro-Hungarian battleship SMS Szent István. Under cover of morning fog, his small, fast motor torpedo boats slipped past escorts and fired. 2 torpedoes slammed into the battleship. The weak underwater defenses collapsed instantly. Despite desperate efforts to save her, the massive dreadnought rolled over and sank. The shocking event was filmed, showing sailors scrambling across the capsizing hull, a haunting symbol of failure. Half of the class would be lost, and the ships that were meant to secure Austrian naval supremacy instead became symbols of wasted ambition and flawed engineering. The Tegethoff class wasn't just a failed warship design. It was proof that politics, pride, and rushed decisions can sink even the mightiest battleship. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet Navy had learned one painful truth. Their new nuclear submarines were powerful, but dangerously unstable. Inside the corridors of Soviet Naval Command, reports piled up. Coolant leaks, failing radiation shields, electrical breakdowns, and unexplained crew illnesses. But rather than admit failure, the government chose secrecy. Every problem was classified. Instead of fixing design flaws, officials blamed the sailors. Radiation sickness was often recorded as food poisoning or flu. Doctors treating submarine crews were forbidden to write the word radiation in medical files. Families of affected sailors rarely learned the truth. Many were told their loved ones died in training accidents or unrelated illnesses. Meanwhile, on board the submarines, life became a constant gamble. Crews served in cramped metal compartments where radiation quietly seeped into the air, water, and even clothing. Many submariners returned from missions exhausted, with burns on their skin, constant nausea, and hair falling out. Some could barely stand by the time they reached port, yet they were sent back to sea again and again because the USSR needed to prove strength to the world. The psychological pressure was immense. Sailors knew there were dangers, but speaking up meant accusations of cowardice, or worse, treason. Officers had to choose between protecting their men or obeying orders. Most had no real choice. Outwardly, Soviet propaganda celebrated these submarines as engineering marvels and heroic defenders of the motherland. But behind closed doors, the Navy was dealing with what was essentially a floating nuclear disaster program, one that threatened not only crews, but also ports, shipyards, and coastal towns. The Cold War demanded silence. And so, the deadly truth remained buried beneath the waves, while more tragedies waited just ahead. As Cold War tensions grew, the Soviet Navy demanded more from its submarines than ever before. Patrols became longer, dives became deeper, and missions pushed the limits of both machine and man. Among the November-class fleet, one submarine was assigned a particularly dangerous objective: to shadow NATO vessels while remaining completely undetected. It sounded like a routine intelligence operation. In reality, it would become a turning point. The submarine departed port carrying a crew already familiar with danger. Many had experienced radiation scares before. Some were veterans of breakdowns and onboard fires. But orders were orders. The Soviet Navy needed proof that its nuclear submarines could operate like the Americans, silently, efficiently, and for extended periods. Soon after the mission began, trouble struck. Deep beneath the ocean's surface, reactor temperatures fluctuated wildly. Warning indicators blinked, then stabilized, then spiked again. Coolant pumps began to rattle. Officers debated whether to abort the mission, but headquarters demanded results, not excuses. The crew pushed forward, praying the systems would hold. They didn't. A coolant failure triggered a chain reaction of problems. Radiation levels began climbing inside the submarine. Air became contaminated. The heat was unbearable. Men worked in suffocating compartments, drenched in sweat and fear, desperately trying to contain the malfunction. Every second mattered. Every mistake could mean death. The reactor crew fought heroically, manually opening valves, venting pressure, and risking direct exposure to radiation to prevent a catastrophic meltdown. Some knew they were sacrificing their health for the rest of the crew. Others refused to leave their posts. Their bravery kept the submarine alive, but at a terrible personal cost. The submarine eventually limped home, mission incomplete, crew weakened, yet the incident remained classified. Official reports softened the truth. Publicly, the submarine returned from a successful operational patrol. Privately, doctors treated sailors for severe radiation exposure, while engineers quietly debated how close they had come to disaster. Once again, the Soviet dream of naval supremacy had nearly turned into a floating nuclear tragedy. But fate still wasn't finished with the November-class submarines. Worse events were yet to come. The November-class submarines had survived radiation leaks, system failures, and near-catastrophic missions. But one danger remained the most terrifying of all: fire. Inside a submarine, flames are not just an emergency, they are a death sentence. On one fateful patrol, disaster struck. Deep underwater and far from help, a sudden malfunction sparked a blaze in one of the compartments. In seconds, the fire exploded into a violent inferno, feeding on electrical cables, fuel vapors, and oxygen lines. Smoke poured through the submarine's narrow corridors. Lights flickered, temperatures skyrocketed. The crew scrambled into action, but onboard fire suppression systems were unreliable, just like so many other parts of the submarine. Panic collided with duty. Men crawled through choking black smoke, desperately trying to seal watertight doors and stop the flames from spreading. Some were trapped between compartments, others fought to keep the submarine stable as equipment failed around them. Decisions had to be made, terrible decisions. To save the vessel and prevent a nuclear reactor catastrophe, officers ordered certain compartments sealed, with sailors still inside. Those trapped knew what it meant, but not a single one disobeyed. They stayed at their posts, protecting the submarine and their crewmates until the very end. Their sacrifice kept the fire contained and prevented the nuclear reactor from spiraling into disaster. Hours later, the surviving crew managed to extinguish the flames, but the submarine was a graveyard of twisted metal, burned wiring, and fallen comrades. When it finally returned to port, Soviet authorities quickly classified everything. Families were given vague explanations, medals were awarded quietly, reports were buried. To the outside world, nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside the Soviet Navy, a horrifying truth was undeniable: these submarines were killing their own sailors. Yet despite the tragedy, the November-class fleet continued to sail, because in the Cold War, power was valued more than safety, and human lives were simply part of the cost. But the story wasn't over. The next chapters would reveal even more chilling consequences of this silent underwater nightmare. When the damaged November-class submarines returned to port after disasters at sea, the danger didn't end. In fact, for many sailors, the real battle was only beginning. Crews who had survived radiation leaks, fires, and near meltdowns stepped onto land looking like heroes, but many never felt the same again. Some collapsed shortly after returning, others developed mysterious illnesses weeks later. Their skin burned, their hair fell out, their bodies weakened. Many were barely more than young men, but their health had aged decades. Yet officially, nothing was wrong. Doctors treating submarine crews were forced to write vague diagnoses: severe fatigue, unspecified complications, respiratory illness. Never the real cause, never the radiation poisoning slowly destroying their bodies. Soviet authorities had a priority: protect the image of Soviet power, no matter the human cost. Acknowledging reactor flaws meant admitting weakness, so instead, sailors were sacrificed in silence. Many were quietly removed from duty, discharged without honors, or sent to remote hospitals where records disappeared into classified archives. Families received almost no explanation. Mothers were told their sons died serving the motherland. Wives were informed their husbands were victims of work-related illness. Children grew up hearing only fragments of the truth. The emotional scars were as deep as the physical ones. Meanwhile, engineers and officials knew the submarines were dangerous, but the Cold War wouldn't wait. The Navy still needed to compete with the United States, so the November class kept sailing. Behind every successful patrol lay hidden suffering. Behind every proud Soviet naval parade marched men who had risked and often lost their health for a project that was never truly safe. The November-class submarines had become floating secrets, carrying not only weapons and nuclear reactors, but stories of sacrifice, pain, and human tragedy that the world would not learn about for years. And still, the most devastating chapters of this story were yet to come.
For years, the Soviet Union managed to hide the truth. Incidents were classified, reports were buried, and sailors' suffering was erased from public record. But secrets cannot stay underwater forever. As time passed, the Cold War balance began to shift. New generations of submarines were developed, and some of the aging November-class boats were retired or quietly scrapped. With each decommissioned submarine came inspections, technical reviews, and shocking discoveries. Engineers found radiation contamination so severe that parts of the submarines were too dangerous to touch. Entire sections were hot zones, saturated with decades of invisible poison. Some submarines were so contaminated that they couldn't even be dismantled safely and instead had to be sealed and left to rust in remote shipyards or underwater storage sites. Meanwhile, former sailors began speaking out. Retired crew members, no longer bound by the strict obedience of military life, started revealing what they had endured. They described constant malfunctions, broken safety systems, desperate emergency repairs, and the terrible human sacrifices hidden behind state secrecy. Their stories cracked open the facade.
Western intelligence agencies had long suspected problems, but now first-hand testimony confirmed just how dangerous these submarines had been. Investigations and historical research exposed design flaws, radiation mismanagement, fires, and near-catastrophic reactor failures that could have changed history if just a few decisions had gone differently. For the first time, the world began to understand. The November-class submarines were not symbols of invincible Soviet strength. They were symbols of how far a superpower was willing to push its people to maintain an illusion of dominance. Yet, even as the truth emerged, recognition came too late for many. Countless sailors had already lost their lives, their health, or their futures. Families had lived in confusion and grief for decades. The price of secrecy had been paid in silence. The November-class submarines faded from active service, but their legacy did not disappear. It lived on in classified archives, in contaminated wrecks, in grieving families, and in the haunting memories of those who survived. But history still had one final chapter to write about these deadly giants beneath the sea.
As the Cold War eventually faded and the Soviet Union collapsed, the truth about the November-class submarines could no longer stay buried. What was once a proud symbol of power had become a haunting reminder of human cost. Years later, historians, naval experts, and former crew members pieced together the full story. What emerged was not a tale of triumph, but a chilling lesson in what happens when ambition outruns responsibility. The November-class submarines had been born out of fear. Fear of falling behind the United States, fear of appearing weak, fear of losing global influence. That fear pushed Soviet leaders to rush technology, ignore warnings, and gamble with lives. They succeeded in building fast, powerful nuclear submarines, but at a devastating price. Today, the November class stands as a chapter many would rather forget, yet one the world must remember. Some of these submarines rest in scrapyards and underwater graveyards, still carrying traces of radiation. Others exist only in photographs, declassified reports, and memories. But their impact echoes in modern naval design, stricter safety standards, and international awareness of nuclear dangers. Most importantly, their true legacy belongs to the sailors. Men who served knowing their lives were constantly at risk. Men who followed orders in silence. Men who fought fires, repaired reactors, endured radiation, and protected their comrades even when the state did not protect them. They were not simply soldiers of a superpower, they were human beings who paid for a political dream with their health, their lives, and their futures. In the end, the November-class submarines did change history, not by winning battles, but by revealing a brutal truth. Power means nothing without responsibility. Technology means nothing without humanity. And secrecy, no matter how strong, cannot hide the cost forever. The submarines may be gone, but their story remains, a warning from the depths.
Throughout the Cold War, naval power meant dominance, and nothing symbolized that power more than nuclear submarines. When the United States successfully developed the world's first operational nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Nautilus, the Soviet Union panicked. Falling behind simply wasn't an option. Joseph Stalin had originally banned nuclear reactor research for ships, fearing it would slow the USSR's race to build nuclear weapons. But as American submarine technology advanced rapidly, Soviet leadership changed course. A new project, Project 627, later known to NATO as the November class, was launched, originally designed to carry a gigantic nuclear torpedo capable of devastating U.S. coastal cities. After Stalin's death, the insane super torpedo plan was abandoned, and the submarine was redesigned as a fast attack vessel. On paper, it looked incredible. 2 nuclear reactors, astonishing underwater speed of over 30 knots, advanced hydrodynamic design, and 8 torpedo tubes. The Soviet Navy proudly believed they had surpassed the United States. But behind the propaganda, disaster was brewing. The submarine's reactors were rushed into production by industries with almost no experience handling nuclear technology. Wrong materials were used, pipes were poorly manufactured, and microscopic cracks formed in the high-pressure systems. Under stress, they would fail, releasing lethal radiation into the confined steel vessel.